Yes, you heard that right. The Iceman is melting a lot sooner than people expected, and now with the newest information coming out around Drake and this album rollout, things are starting to look way messier than anybody originally thought. And somehow, the situation became even more chaotic after DJ Academics stepped in and added fuel to the fire with a new set of comments that immediately got the entire internet talking. Because now fans are seriously starting to wonder whether Drake is preparing to drop early, whether the rollout is already changing behind the scenes, or whether there is an even bigger move happening that nobody fully sees yet. Before we go any further, though, make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and support the channel because this entire Iceman situation is getting crazier by the day. The fan wars are already unbearable, the Drake stans are defending every single move like their lives depend on it, and the second anybody questions this rollout, they instantly get accused of hating. But honestly, the concerns people have about this album are not even coming from random outsiders anymore. A lot of the speculation is being fueled by people connected directly to Drake's own camp. And that is exactly why the Academics clip became such a massive talking point. Because whether people want to admit it or not, DJ Academics has basically become one of Drake's closest media allies over the years. Whenever Drake wants a message pushed into the culture without saying it himself, somehow Academics always ends up being the one delivering it. So when he suddenly starts telling fans to stay alert because things could happen way sooner than expected, people naturally start paying attention immediately. According to academics, movement is already happening behind the scenes. He hinted that Drake is filming things, preparing visuals, and getting ready to activate this rollout in a much bigger way. But what made the comments feel strange is that Drake already appeared to have a direction for this album rollout. There was already speculation about release timing, already teaser content dropping, already a narrative forming around Iceman. So if everything was supposedly planned out already, why suddenly create this sense of urgency and unpredictability again? That is where the theories start getting interesting. Because now fans are trying to figure out whether Drake is preparing a surprise single, an early album drop, another diss track, or maybe even an entirely different project altogether. And honestly, with how chaotic this era already feels, none of those possibilities would even be shocking anymore. Drake has spent the last year moving in a way that feels far more emotional and reactionary than calculated, and the Iceman rollout already carries a weird amount of tension around it. Part of the reason this whole thing is so fascinating is because this does not feel like a normal Drake album era at all. Usually when Drake drops, there is this sense of confidence and dominance around everything he does. His rollouts normally feel untouchable, but this time feels different. There is bitterness all over this rollout already, and the promotional material itself seems built around conflict, revenge, and proving something to people. Instead of a victory lap, Iceman feels more like Drake trying to reclaim control after one of the roughest stretches of his career. And obviously a huge reason for that is Kendrick Lamar. Ever since that battle exploded, Drake has looked more vulnerable than he ever has before. The internet turned on him in ways people never expected to see, and for the first time in years, Drake no longer felt untouchable in the culture. That entire situation changed the public perception around him, and now this album feels like his attempt to take the narrative back. You can already see Kendrick's presence hanging over this rollout. The cryptic imagery, the hidden references, the subtle jabs, all of it feels intentional. Drake clearly wants people analyzing every detail. And whether the disses end up being direct or subliminal, everybody already knows Kendrick is going to be one of the central focuses of this album cycle. But Kendrick is not the only target here. Because another massive storyline surrounding Iceman appears to be Drake's relationship with UMG and Lucian Grange. And honestly, this part of the rollout might be even more interesting. For years, Drake was seen as the golden child of the music industry. He represented streaming dominance, chart success, playlist control, and commercial consistency. Everything about Drake symbolized the modern music business operating at its absolute peak. Now suddenly, Drake seems determined to present himself as somebody betrayed by the very system that once elevated him. That is why so many people are describing Iceman as almost a breakup album in a professional sense, because this era feels like Drake processing the collapse of relationships that once defined his career. His tension with UMG is no longer hidden behind vague lyrics or subtle shots. The rollout visuals themselves are practically screaming it directly now. And that is what makes the situation so awkward. Because despite the apparent shots Drake is taking at the label, they are still heavily tied to the business side of his career. They still profit from his music. They still benefit financially from everything attached to his brand. So watching Drake publicly move into this rebellious anti-label position while still operating inside that same system creates a really strange dynamic. That is also why some people believe this rollout is partly about leverage. Because when academics suddenly starts hinting at surprise drops and unpredictable moves, it almost feels like the Drake camp is trying to pressure the industry itself. Almost like they are attempting to create urgency around negotiations, contracts, or business conversations happening behind the scenes. And honestly, we have seen artists play games like this before. Rollout confusion has become one of the biggest marketing tools in music now. Surprise drops, fake release dates, hidden deluxe albums, cryptic teasers. Artists understand that chaos itself generates attention, and Drake, more than almost anybody, understands how to dominate online conversation cycles. But the difference this time is that the chaos does not entirely feel controlled. That is why fans are nervous about this rollout. Usually when Drake moves unpredictably, it still feels strategic underneath everything. With Iceman, there are moments where it genuinely feels like the plan is changing in real time depending on public reaction. And maybe that is because Drake himself is in unfamiliar territory. For over a decade, he operated from a position of total dominance. Every album debuted huge. Every feature became an event. Every release controlled the culture. But now he is coming off a period where public opinion became deeply divided. The Kendrick battle damaged his aura. The lawsuits made him look defensive. And the constant online narratives chipped away at the untouchable image he spent years building. So now Iceman carries pressure that previous Drake albums simply did not have. Even the title itself reflects that pressure perfectly. Iceman is clearly meant to represent this cold, emotionless, calculated version of Drake. He wants to look detached, strategic, and unbothered. But ironically, everything surrounding this rollout feels emotional. Every teaser feels personal. Every move feels loaded with resentment and frustration. That is why so many people believe this album is going to contain some of Drake's most aggressive music in years, because underneath all the icy branding, there is clearly a lot of anger boiling beneath the surface. The rollout already hints at competition, betrayal, revenge, and unfinished business. And when artists create from that emotional space, the results can either become career-defining or completely self-destructive. At the same time, though, Drake still remains one of the smartest marketers in music history. Even people who dislike him cannot stop talking about him. And that is part of why moments like the Academics clip become so important. Suddenly, everybody is theorizing again. Fans are dissecting timelines, streamers are reacting, social media is exploding with speculation, and before Drake even drops music, he already controls the conversation again. That ability to dominate attention is still one of his greatest strengths. But now attention alone is not enough anymore. People want substance. People want direction. People want proof that Drake still has something meaningful to say artistically beyond just responding to drama. And that is why Iceman may end up becoming one of the most important albums of his entire career. Because if this project succeeds critically and commercially, Drake immediately regains momentum and shifts the narrative again. But if the album feels overly bitter, repetitive, or obsessed with feuds, then the criticism surrounding this era is only going to grow louder. And honestly, that is what makes this entire rollout so interesting to watch unfold in real time. You can feel the pressure behind every single move. Every teaser feels calculated. Every rumor suddenly carries huge importance because people know Drake is operating from a much more vulnerable position than he has in years. Even the fan reactions feel different this time. Normally, Drake fans move with complete confidence before an album release. But now there is nervous energy everywhere. People are defending the rollout aggressively before the album has even dropped, and that usually says a lot. Meanwhile, critics are already preparing to dissect every lyric for hidden disses, contradictions, or Kendrick references. And you already know social media is going to turn this release into complete chaos the second the album finally lands. Because at this point, Drake is no longer just dropping music. Every move he makes now feels tied directly to the larger conversation surrounding his legacy. So now the big question becomes this: what exactly is Drake preparing to do next? Is he really dropping earlier than expected? Is another diss track coming? Is the rollout changing behind the scenes, or is this simply another calculated move designed to keep everybody glued to their timelines waiting for the next update? Whatever the answer is, one thing is very clear. The Iceman era is already one of the most dramatic, heavily scrutinized, and chaotic periods of Drake's career. And if things already feel this tense before the album even arrives, imagine how insane everything is about to become once the actual music finally drops. And honestly, once you start looking deeper into the business side of everything happening around Drake right now, the rollout starts making a lot more sense. Because people keep acting like all of this chaos is random, but when you connect the dots between the label tension, the cryptic marketing, academics teasing surprise moves, and now these insider reports floating around, it really feels like Drake is trying to pull off some kind of massive strategic play behind the scenes. A lot of people immediately started comparing the situation to what Frank Ocean did years ago with Def Jam. And if you remember that whole situation, Frank famously dropped Endless to fulfill his contract obligations before turning around and independently releasing Blonde just days later. That move completely changed the conversation around artist leverage and label control because Frank essentially found a loophole that allowed him to escape the system while still keeping the real prize for himself. Now, obviously, Drake's situation is completely different in a lot of ways, but when people started hearing academics hint that something could drop earlier than expected, and then insider accounts suddenly started posting things like Scary Hours 4, fans immediately started wondering whether Drake was preparing some kind of similar maneuver. Maybe not in the exact same way, but at least in the sense of trying to create leverage, pressure the label, or manipulate expectations around the rollout itself. And once those Scary Hours 4 rumors started circulating, the academics' comments suddenly carried way more weight than people originally thought, because now it no longer sounded like random hype. It started sounding like Drake's camp was preparing audiences for multiple releases, surprise content, or some kind of staggered rollout strategy designed to completely dominate attention for weeks. And honestly, from a marketing perspective, it would make perfect sense. Drake knows he cannot afford a normal rollout right now. The pressure surrounding Iceman is too high. The public perception around him is too unstable. And after everything that happened with Kendrick Lamar, Drake probably understands that he cannot move the same way he used to anymore. That Kendrick battle changed everything. One of the biggest criticisms Drake faced during that whole situation was how predictable his responses became. Every move felt telegraphed. Every angle got dissected before he could even fully execute it. And by the end of the battle, it felt like Kendrick controlled the energy of the entire internet, while Drake constantly looked like he was reacting instead of leading. So now with Iceman, it feels like Drake is trying to rebuild this sense of unpredictability around himself again. He wants fans constantly guessing. He wants people refreshing timelines wondering whether a surprise drop is coming. He wants the rollout itself to feel dangerous and unstable because that creates conversation, speculation, and attention. But at the same time, there is another layer here that makes the entire thing feel much less artistic and way more business-driven. Because when you really look at Drake's current relationship with UMG, it becomes obvious that this rollout is heavily tied to leverage and negotiation as much as it is music itself. And honestly, this is where a lot of the criticism around Drake starts becoming harsher. Because despite all the rebellious energy surrounding Iceman, a lot of people simply do not buy Drake as somebody truly willing to separate himself from the machine. That is why comparisons to artists like Frank Ocean, Kanye West, or even Kendrick Lamar feel complicated. Those artists have all shown in different ways a willingness to challenge systems, build outside ventures, or take massive creative and business risks independently. With Drake, people do not really see that same mentality. At the end of the day, Drake has always benefited enormously from the system itself. He became the perfect face of the streaming era. Playlist dominance, radio support, massive label backing, corporate partnerships. Drake mastered the machine better than almost anybody in modern music history. So now seeing him suddenly position himself as this anti-label underdog feels strange to a lot of people. And that is why many critics believe Drake is not actually trying to escape the system at all. Instead, they think he is simply trying to renegotiate his place within it. Because realistically, if things ever completely collapsed with UMG, Most people do not believe Drake would suddenly become some fully independent artist building his own empire from scratch. More likely, he would simply move to another major label situation, another giant corporate partnership, or another heavily structured business deal that still protects him within the same industry framework. That is the difference people keep pointing out between Drake and some of his peers. When you look around hip hop, many of the biggest artists built major ventures outside of music itself. Kanye turned himself into a fashion and business powerhouse. Travis Scott built one of the biggest branding empires in modern entertainment. Kendrick Lamar moved into film, media, and creative directing. Tyler, the creator, built entire lifestyle brands and festivals around his identity. Meanwhile, Drake has mostly remained tied directly to the music machine, and because of that, people question whether Drake actually has the business instincts to operate outside that environment successfully. Critics argue that Drake has spent most of his career being protected by the industry instead of challenging it. So now, when things become uncomfortable, he suddenly looks stuck between wanting to criticize the machine while still desperately needing it at the same time. And honestly, that tension is all over the Iceman rollout. Because the more reports that come out, the more it feels like Drake is trying to manufacture momentum through quantity and chaos rather than confidence. That is why these scary hours 4 rumors matter so much. Because now people are wondering whether Drake's plan is simply to overwhelm the culture again with content. More songs, more projects, more surprise drops, more diss records, more social media moments. Essentially trying to flood the conversation until the narrative shifts back in his favor. But that strategy also comes with a huge risk, because if Drake really is preparing multiple projects or an oversized rollout packed with endless material, then people immediately start worrying about quality control. And honestly, that criticism already follows Drake heavily. One of the biggest complaints surrounding Drake albums over the last several years is that they often feel bloated. Too many songs, too much filler, too much content designed for streams instead of cohesion. Even fans who enjoy his music regularly admit that his albums could benefit from being shorter and more focused. So if Drake now responds to pressure by dropping even more music, the fear is that the rollout could become overwhelming in the worst possible way. Instead of feeling exciting, it could start feeling exhausting. And that is exactly why so many people are nervous about this era. Because underneath all the mysterious marketing and cryptic teasing, there is a growing feeling that Drake is trying to force a comeback narrative into existence. Not necessarily through artistic reinvention, but through sheer volume and nonstop visibility. And maybe that works commercially. Drake still has one of the biggest fan bases in music. He still dominates streaming platforms. He still generates headlines with almost anything he does. But culturally, the challenge is much harder now because audiences are approaching this rollout with far more skepticism than before. Even academics accidentally revealed part of that reality himself. During one of his streams, he basically admitted that Drake is not receiving the same level of support from UMG that he once had. And whether people like hearing that or not, it matters. Because for years, Drake benefited from being almost completely fail-proof within the industry system. Massive playlist placement, radio dominance, endless promotional support. The machine behind Drake was enormous. Now suddenly that relationship feels fractured, and if Drake no longer has the same industry backing protecting him, then this rollout becomes much riskier than people realize. Because for the first time in a long time, Drake actually has to fight for momentum instead of simply inheriting it automatically. That is probably one of the biggest reasons why Iceman has taken so long to fully materialize in the first place. Behind all the teasers and mysterious branding, it feels like Drake has been searching for the perfect angle, the perfect narrative, the perfect strategy that could restore the perception of dominance around him again. And honestly, the more this rollout continues, the more it feels like Drake's entire plan revolves around manufacturing the strongest comeback optics possible. Not necessarily rebuilding organically, but creating an environment where people feel forced to acknowledge him again through nonstop visibility and calculated moments. That is why academics keeps teasing things without fully saying them directly, because the rollout itself depends on suspense right now. Drake needs audiences constantly wondering what is about to happen next. He needs unpredictability because unpredictability creates engagement. And to be fair, it is working to some extent. People cannot stop talking about this album already. Every teaser becomes a debate, every rumor becomes a headline, every academic's clip spreads across social media instantly. But eventually, the music itself has to deliver. Because no amount of rollout manipulation, industry politics, or surprise marketing can permanently save an album if audiences ultimately feel disconnected from the actual material. And that is the real pressure surrounding Iceman right now. This is no longer just another Drake album release. This feels like a project tied directly to his reputation, his business positioning, his cultural relevance, and the future direction of his career all at once. Which means if this rollout succeeds, Drake regains control of the narrative immediately. But if it fails, then all of this teasing, chaos, and manufactured suspense is only going to make the backlash even louder once the music finally arrives. And that's exactly what these insider sources seem to be hinting at right now. The plan isn't just to drop another Drake album and hope it sticks. It feels like they are trying to manipulate the entire system itself and create a rollout that hip hop has honestly never seen before. After months of cryptic social media posts, awkward teaser clips, and constant hints from people around Drake's camp, one thing they may have actually been truthful about is that Iceman is going to be unlike any Drake project we've seen. The problem is that different does not necessarily mean good. It could just mean bigger, more bloated, more calculated, and more engineered around streaming tactics than actual artistry. Because when you really start piecing together all the clues, the concern is not just about the music quality itself, it's about what this album is trying to represent structurally. Drake seems less interested in making a concise body of work and more interested in creating an endless content machine that can dominate streaming platforms for weeks, regardless of whether people actually love the project. That's where this whole thing starts to feel less like an album rollout and more like a giant industry experiment designed to maximize numbers at every possible level. And honestly, once you look at the teases closely, there is a clear sense of duality throughout the entire Iceman concept. Even though Drake has never exactly been known as the strongest thematic artist, it genuinely feels like they are building toward multiple versions or multiple sides of the same project. Between the visual aesthetics, the cryptic references, and now the rumors surrounding Scary Hours 4, everything points toward this album being split into separate experiences. That's where things start getting ridiculous. Because if Scary Hours 4 is dropping alongside Iceman, then we are already talking about a double album at minimum. But honestly, it might go even further than that. At this point, it genuinely feels possible that Drake is preparing the first true triple album experience of the streaming era. Not because the music demands it creatively, but because the numbers benefit from it commercially. And that's the key distinction here. It seems like Iceman and Scary Hours 4 are technically going to function as separate releases with different moments, different rollouts, and potentially even different release dates. But in the end, they may all be bundled together under one massive umbrella project. We already saw Drake test this formula with For All the Dogs and the Scary Hours 3 expansion afterward. The difference this time is that instead of adding onto the album later, it looks like the entire thing is being designed from the start as one gigantic streaming package. So now we may be entering a reality where Drake releases an album that essentially gets two launches, two first week boosts, and an absurd amount of songs all feeding into the exact same streaming total. That is where this becomes less about music and more about gaming the system itself. Because if this thing ends up being 30, 40, or even 50 songs long across multiple sections, then Drake instantly gains an enormous statistical advantage over every other artist in hip hop. And when you really think about it, this strategy makes perfect sense for Drake specifically. Right now, he is coming off one of the roughest stretches of his career. The Kendrick situation damaged his image heavily, the UMG drama exposed cracks in his relationship with the industry, and culturally he no longer feels untouchable in the way he once did. So if you cannot completely dominate through momentum or public perception anymore, the next move is obvious. Dominate through volume. That's why this entire rollout feels engineered around quantity over quality. If Drake can flood streaming services with enough material, then the raw numbers themselves can become the narrative regardless of whether people actually connect with the music emotionally. It becomes less about replay value and more about sheer exposure. The more tracks there are, the more streams there are to collect. It's honestly the ultimate streaming era loophole. Just look at the math behind it. Kendrick Lamar's GNX had 12 songs and still managed to put up massive first week numbers. But if Drake releases a project with 3 times that amount, the calculations completely change. A listener only has to interact with a fraction of the album for Drake's overall stream count to explode. Even casual listeners who skim through the project contribute to the numbers in a huge way simply because there are so many songs available to stream. That's the flaw in the streaming system that Drake has mastered better than almost anyone. The album does not necessarily need to be cohesive anymore. It does not even need to be universally loved. It just needs to exist in large enough quantities that people clicking around inside the tracklist creates gigantic totals. That's why this entire rollout feels so calculated. Drake understands the metrics better than almost any artist alive, and he knows exactly how to use them to maintain the illusion of dominance. And the truth is, most listeners probably will not even consume this album front to back if it really ends up being this massive. People are going to scroll through, grab 3 or 4 songs they like, maybe throw one into a playlist, and move on. But because streaming counts every interaction, Drake still wins statistically. The album experience itself becomes secondary to the algorithm. That's why so many people have criticized the direction Drake has taken over the years. He has become one of the faces of turning albums into content dumps rather than carefully crafted artistic statements. And if Iceman really becomes this oversized triple project rollout, then it may represent the absolute peak of that philosophy. Especially because if you compare it to what some of the best rap albums in recent memory have done, the contrast becomes obvious. Albums like Kendrick Lamar's GNX, Tyler, The Creator's Chromacopia, and other major releases from this era succeeded because they were focused, intentional, and concise. Most of them stayed within that 12 to 14 song range. They prioritized cohesion, replay value, and actual artistic direction instead of trying to overwhelm listeners with endless content. That's what makes this Drake situation feel so frustrating to a lot of hip-hop fans. Instead of responding to criticism by refining his craft, tightening his albums, or focusing on quality control, it feels like he is doubling down on the exact tendencies people have complained about for years. More filler, more bloated track lists, more calculated streaming tactics, more attempts to dominate through quantity rather than substance. And honestly, if this rumor ends up being true, then Iceman might combine every controversial aspect of Drake's recent catalog into one gigantic release: the sprawling nature of Scorpion, the overloaded playlist-style structure of Certified Lover Boy, the expanded Scary Hours concept, all of it wrapped together into one enormous package designed to maximize streams and attention, which is why people need to prepare themselves now. Because if this rollout unfolds the way it currently looks, the conversation around Iceman is not just going to be about whether the music is good or bad, it's going to become a much larger discussion about the state of streaming, the future of album formats, and whether commercial manipulation has completely overtaken artistry in mainstream rap. And the craziest part is that Drake probably knows exactly what people are going to say ahead of time. He knows critics are going to call it bloated. He knows hip-hop fans are going to complain about filler tracks. He knows people will accuse him of chasing streams. But if the numbers are gigantic at the end of the week, then in his eyes, the strategy worked anyway. That's the strange place hip-hop has reached in the streaming era. Commercial success and artistic respect no longer move together the way they once did. An album can dominate platforms statistically while still leaving listeners exhausted creatively. And Drake, more than almost any artist, understands how to exploit that divide. So if this truly ends up being the first triple album-style streaming release, then regardless of whether people love it or hate it, it is going to become a defining moment for modern rap economics. Not because it pushes the art form forward creatively, but because it may expose just how broken the current system really is. And when you really think about it, this whole strategy starts to look like Drake combining every trick he has used throughout the streaming era into one final massive rollout. We already saw him experiment with bloated track lists on For All the Dogs, and then extend the conversation with the Scary Hours editions afterward. That album was already designed to maximize streams through sheer size alone, and now it feels like Drake is taking that formula and pushing it even further with Iceman. Because at the end of the day, the reason for dropping this much music is obvious. More songs mean more streams. More streams mean bigger headlines. Bigger headlines create the illusion of dominance, and dominance is exactly what Drake needs right now more than ever before. He wants to reclaim the feeling that he still controls hip hop commercially, even after everything that has happened over the last couple of years. And if he can flood the market long enough, he probably believes the numbers themselves will eventually overpower the criticism. But the weirdest part of all this is not even the music itself. It's the business side happening behind the scenes. Because if Drake's relationship with UMG is truly damaged the way people believe it is, then why would he willingly hand over an even larger amount of content to the same machine he seems frustrated with? That's where the entire situation starts to feel confusing. On one hand, Drake appears angry with the label system. He's throwing subtle shots, teasing industry frustration, and trying to position himself as somebody battling against the corporate structure. But on the other hand, everything he is doing still feels completely dependent on that same structure. Instead of stepping away from the machine, it almost looks like he is trying harder than ever to prove himself useful to it. And honestly, that's why some people believe this entire rollout could still be part of a negotiation tactic. When DJ academics started hinting that things may arrive earlier than expected, and then rumors of Scary Hours 4 started appearing immediately afterward, it felt less like coincidence and more like pressure being applied publicly. Almost like Drake is trying to remind the label that he can still generate massive engagement if they continue backing him properly. Because if there's one thing labels love more than artistry, it's consistency. They want somebody who can continuously generate numbers, attention, controversy, and conversation. And despite everything that has happened, Drake still provides all of that. Even people who claim they are tired of him still end up talking about every rollout, every diss, every teaser, and every strange industry move surrounding him. That attention still has value. So maybe Drake's play here is simpler than people realize. Maybe he understands that UMG still needs somebody capable of dominating playlists and driving streaming traffic on a massive scale. And if that's the case, then dropping multiple connected projects under the ICEMAN umbrella becomes less about artistic vision and more about proving commercial usefulness. And honestly, if Scary Hours 4 really arrives before the main album, then the structure starts to make even more sense. It could function almost like a prelude project designed to clear the air before the actual Iceman experience begins. Something similar to how J. Cole used his surprise EP releases to address tension and set the stage before larger moments. The difference is that Drake's version would probably be far more chaotic and much more focused on disses. Because let's be real for a second. What else is Drake even going to talk about at this stage? The Kendrick Lamar feud has completely consumed this era of his career. The UMG tension is hanging over everything. His public image has shifted dramatically, so naturally it feels inevitable that Scary Hours 4 becomes the place where he unloads on everybody he feels betrayed him over the last few years. And if that happens, then the project could easily become one long grievance session. Drake going after Kendrick again. Drake taking more shots at Lucian Grange and UMG. Drake addressing old industry relationships that fell apart. Drake revisiting every slight, every rumor, every narrative he thinks damaged him. Honestly, it would not even be surprising if random celebrities caught strays just because Drake feels like making headlines again. That's why some people think the Scary Hours side of the rollout may end up functioning differently than Iceman itself. Scary Hours 4 could be the aggressive, reactionary, confrontational side of the project, while Iceman becomes the more polished commercial centerpiece meant to dominate streaming numbers afterward. If that's truly the structure, then Drake is essentially trying to create multiple eras inside one rollout cycle. And whether people love it or hate it, that's honestly a very calculated strategy, because even negative reactions would still keep the conversation alive. Drake understands that controversy fuels engagement in the streaming era. Every diss becomes a headline. Every sneak shot becomes social media discourse. Every bloated release becomes a debate about numbers versus quality. And as long as people keep talking, the machine keeps moving. But the major difference now compared to albums like Scorpion or even Certified Lover Boy is that the culture itself has changed. Back then, Drake still had the benefit of near-universal momentum. Even people who criticized the albums still accepted him as the dominant figure in mainstream rap. That automatic goodwill no longer exists. The Kendrick Lamar battle changed that permanently. It exposed cracks in Drake's public perception that were impossible to ignore afterward. Suddenly, The internet wasn't treating him like the untouchable superstar anymore. Instead, people started questioning everything: the authenticity, the writing, the formulas, the streaming strategies, even the image itself. And because of that, this Iceman rollout feels much riskier than any Drake album release before it. If he drops a gigantic multi-part project and it lands poorly, there may not be another easy recovery path this time. The culture has become far less forgiving, and attention spans have shifted dramatically. People are no longer automatically invested in Drake albums the way they once were. That's why this rollout feels so high stakes. Drake is trying to force a comeback narrative through sheer scale: bigger rollout, bigger album, bigger streaming totals, bigger controversy, bigger headlines. But bigger does not always mean better, especially in an era where listeners increasingly gravitate toward focused and intentional projects instead of endless playlists disguised as albums. And honestly, if this thing truly turns into a 40-plus song experience spread across multiple connected releases, then Drake is gambling everything on the idea that quantity can still overpower cultural fatigue. That's a dangerous bet to make in 2026. Because if people reject it, then the backlash is going to be brutal. Critics will tear it apart for being bloated. Hip-hop fans will accuse him of manipulating streaming metrics again. Casual listeners may simply lose interest halfway through. And if the numbers fail to meet expectations after all this buildup, then suddenly the untouchable Drake image disappears completely. That's why this entire rollout feels so desperate to some people. It's not just an album release anymore. It feels like Drake trying to prove he still matters at the highest possible level, and when artists start chasing validation that aggressively, the pressure becomes enormous. Still, regardless of how people personally feel about Drake, there is no denying that the outcome of this rollout is going to have a huge impact on hip-hop conversations moving forward. Because if this strategy works commercially, then labels are going to pay attention. More artists may start experimenting with oversized multi-stage streaming projects designed purely around maximizing metrics. And if it fails, then it could become a warning sign that the streaming era formula Drake helped pioneer is finally starting to collapse under its own weight. Either way, the next few months are going to be chaotic. Whether it's Scary Hours 4, Iceman, surprise drops, diss records, industry drama, or endless social media discourse, Drake is clearly preparing to dominate the conversation again one way or another. The only question now is whether people actually want what he's selling anymore. And honestly, that's the part Drake himself may not fully understand yet, because forcing attention is not the same thing as earning excitement. You can flood the timeline, you can dominate playlists, you can engineer giant first-week numbers, but none of that guarantees cultural respect anymore. So now all we can really do is wait and see how this unfolds. Because if these rumors are accurate, then hip-hop is about to enter one of the strangest and most over-the-top album rollouts we've seen in years. And whether it ends in a massive comeback or a complete disaster, everybody is going to be watching when it happens.